Good evening and welcome to this final edition in our series of webinars where we focus on going global. For those who missed the first two webinars, just a quick recap, they are available on our website. But the first one we focused on global structuring when looking at offshore investing. We looked at the pros and cons of different structures and the structures you need to consider when investing offshore. The second one we spoke and specifically around global tax structuring. So quite a lot of detail. We went through a case study there, so a lot of detail there for those that want to refer back and just understand all the tax consequences. Tonight I'm joined by our Head of Fiduciary Tax and Advisory Services, Stanley Broun, and we're going to be focusing on global estate planning. So again, tonight we're just going to set the scene with just speaking a bit around global estate planning, why it's important, and then we're going to unpack a case study again, just to think about all the elements and what makes up a global estate plan and basically your estate plan. I think we talk about these things a lot, but people don't always think about all the elements of this. So we're going to dig into that a bit. And just a reminder, we will be taking questions throughout this. So please send through your questions as we go through this webinar. I will be getting them through on my iPad here. So I'll try working the questions as we get through this case study. We'll deal with some of the questions after the case study if we don't get into them. And if there's anything left afterwards, we'll put those through into writing to everyone that attended the webinar. So without further ado, Stanley, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, pleasure. Looking forward to this discussion. So I think for those who don't know Stanley, so as I said, Stanley heads up our fiduciary tax and advisory services at Sanlam Private Wealth. He's been in the industry for about 12 years, got a master's degree, a post honorary diploma at least, a postgrad diploma.
Yeah.
In international tax. So Stanley, we look forward to what you're going to share with us tonight. And let's just dive into this. So just can you please unpack why it is important for clients to think about and advisors to talk to their clients about estate planning?
Estate planning, I think, especially in the times that we are living in now, a lot of clients are particularly paying more attention to their personal affairs. And estate planning is a very important part of looking at your personal affairs. And what's important with your estate planning is always to ensure that your estate planning is customized and is unique for you as a specific client. So one will ask, what is your objective as a client? You've accumulated all of this wealth. What is your objective? How do you want these assets to be protected until date of death? And how do you want these assets to be distributed at your date of death? So that specific type of estate planning is very unique for our clients. We focus on specific elements, so it's more than just pushing a lot of numbers into an Excel spreadsheet. And normally when we talk about estate duty, the first thing that comes to people's mind is, how do I save estate duty? How do I save taxes? But it's bigger than that, it's more than that. And I think sometimes when the driving force behind your decision making is only tax, you actually miss a lot of crucial points. So estate duty is key, especially for your wealthy clients that has accumulated quite a bit of wealth, and there are a lot of elements one will have to look at in order to make sure that at your date of death that basically everything is done properly, that everything is done in a way that will actually also ensure, because there is an element of ensuring that there can be a bit of reducing that estate duty liability, reducing some taxes during your lifetime, but that are all the elements that actually comes through in your estate duty planning, yeah.
Okay, but as I'm listening to you talking about this, and you say clients' wishes and how they want these assets to be protected. Now, if you think about any single individual, they start at some point, they accumulate assets, and your life changes over time. So your situation with your kids change. I mean, kids immigrate. We see that quite a bit, amongst our clients at the moment. So I would assume it's quite important to review this on a regular basis. What's the guidance on that?
Yes, so it must be reviewed. Normally I would advise client every year, if some significant changes took place, to review that estate duty planning. If your kids has moved, if they've decided to settle in Australia or settle in the UK or settle in the US, your circumstances has changed. So what you want to do is to make sure that at the end, what you want to get, what you want to achieve in your estate duty planning in distributing your assets to those specific beneficiaries, that it can actually happen in a much more fluent manner, rather than just sitting and seeing that your children have left South Africa, they have ceased their tax residency, but then you find that some of them are still actually beneficiaries of a South African trust. But with that, there is tax consequences. But if you actually have done your estate planning, one could have planned much better in order to reduce that estate, that capital gains tax effect, for example, on the distribution of assets to a non-tax resident, and actually save you taxes in that regard and plan it much better.
Okay, Stanley, before we get into this case study, maybe what are the main elements that you look at when you work with the client through an estate plan?
So when we sit with the client and we look at the client's estate planning, I normally tell the client, give me everything. I want to know everything. Please don't leave anything out. I want to know what's all your assets, what's all your liabilities. And I'm not just talking of elements that forms part of your estate duty calculation, but I'm also talking about your life policies, your pension, your provident fund, and all of those other elements. So I ask the client, give me everything. I want to know where's all the assets locally, where's all the assets offshore, where's all your children's, where's all, if there's any liabilities, if there's any company shares, if there's any loan accounts. So I want to know everything, because that puts me in a position to do a proper estate planning report for the client. But when you do that estate planning report for the client, what you will actually notice is that you now also get the opportunity as a client to see where's the potential planning opportunities. Now we're talking about your estate duty. Now we start talking about your tax. How can we reduce it? How can we look at liquidity? So it's important when I sit with the client, I tell the client, give me everything. Even if you think it's not important, I want to know everything. How are you married? Are you married in community of property, out of community of property, with or without your accruals? So all of those small elements play a key role when it comes to your estate duty planning. Yeah.
Now, the first thing you said there was clients need to disclose everything. We know a lot of clients are not that good at disclosing everything. So how do you deal with that element? And I think for the advisors out, listening tonight, so I think everyone's got a different way, but I think part of what you explain now is how you try and explain the risk and the benefits, of not disclosing everything. How do you deal with that with clients?
With clients, it has, for me, the key with clients is trust. The client needs to be able to trust you. So sometimes you have to walk a road with the client for the client to be able to trust you. And as the client starts trusting you, the client is starting to actually open up more about their affairs. But also when you display the expertise that you've got now, you can assist the clients. You're starting to identify elements where the client's got an opportunity to make a better choice in terms of their estate planning. Clients become more open, clients becomes more transparent with all of their assets and all of their liabilities. And then basically from there, the client can get the full benefit of a proper estate plan. Yeah.
Fantastic. And I think that set up the case study quite nicely. So I think this is quite a complicated case study. So what we've done again this week is put a slide together to try and work through all the elements. So the elements will be on the screen. And as we work through it, I'll unpack the case study, and then Stanley you'll take us through how you typically in this scenario work with clients. Now, for everyone's benefit, what we've done, again, similar to the last webinar, is we've taken practical examples that Stanley and the team deal with, and we deal with our clients on a regular basis. So these are real-life scenarios. We've just packed a couple of complicated cases together here. And just to start this off, so we have a husband and wife who's married basically with two children who are minors. So they married out of community of property specifically. Now, for the husband, this is his second marriage. So he's got two kids from an ex-wife, and those kids are in their early 20s. And we'll get into the reason for the ages in a bit. If we get into the asset side of this, so the husband has got a range of different assets, all right? So first, he's got a couple of retirement assets, so pension fund, provident fund, retirement annuity. He's got a couple of life policies, so he's got some life cover that we'll get into in a bit. And then there's quite a couple of non-retirement assets, we'll call them after-tax money, essentially. So over time, this client basically used his foreign investment allowance, the 10 million rand and the 1 million rand, and they basically took that out over a period of time. And what the client did with this is basically buy a couple of shares directly in the UK, so direct listed shares in the UK, direct listed stocks in the US. So the little bracket says just for foreign investment allowance at FIA. And then also there's a couple of investments in Irish-based unit trust funds. So those Irish CISs, those are basically just funds that are domiciled in the Irish jurisdiction. So a lot of the funds, so if you buy an offshore fund, there's different jurisdictions where you can buy these funds. This is typically in Ireland in this example. The client is also 100% owner of a private company. So he's a sole director and owner of a private company. And he's got a loan to that private company. And then there's a couple more things that come in here. So there's an old family trust that the client set up some time ago. And this family trust, the current beneficiaries are his wife and his 4 children at this stage. That trust owns a family home and some shares, and that was basically funded through a loan from the husband. And then, talking to the point we mentioned earlier, where people don't disclose all their assets, there's also a loan to an offshore trust that the wife does not know about. And the beneficiaries there is the husband and the 4 children. And that trust owns a UK residence and some global direct shares. And then just a couple of extra notes. So the client set up a worldwide will, and we mentioned this a previous time as well. It's not uncommon to see that these wills are drafted in Afrikaans with some of our clients. So there are a couple of changes the husband brought into the will after the divorce. So firstly, he bequeathed all the shares in the company to the local family trust, so the one in blue there. The remaining assets it's basically been bequeathed, so everything, all the other assets there has basically been bequeathed to his wife and children. But in the will, he stated that, if the children are under the age of 25 at the time of his demise, that the assets will vest in the family trust. And then just a couple of further notes there. The husband did not disclose all assets to his advisors and attorneys or family over the period of his existence and the accumulation of these assets. And as I said earlier, the family is not aware of this offshore trust. So that's something we'll touch on in a bit. And then, as we always see with these clients, they think that in their personal opinion, there should be an easy wind-up of the estate. And his last will and wishes is that, all of these assets should be dealt with as written in the will. That
is the typical type of client we sometimes deal with.
Okay, so I know that's a lot to take in, so we're going to leave this on screen for people to refer back to, and we're going to keep referring back to this as well. So Stanley, when you see, and this is not an uncommon scenario that we see with our clients, so how do you start unpacking this with the client? Where do you start with this?
So basically after I've received all of the assets and liabilities of the client, I would normally first ask the client a few questions. From this specific scenario, we noticed that the client is divorced. So he's got an ex-wife, he's got married again, so he's got an existing wife. And the marriage regime plays an important role. So it's important to know if the client is married in community of property or out of community of property. In this scenario, the client is married out of community of property, subject to the accrual system. So that's key, because how that plays a role is that if the husband's estate at his date of death is greater than the wife's estate at his date of death, the wife has got accrual claim against his estate. So what a lot of clients sometimes do is when they draft their will, they bequeath a portion of the assets to the surviving spouse, and then the other assets they basically bequeath to the rest of the family members, whether it's the children or to whom else they want to bequeath it, or to the trust. But what is key is to know that the wife has got a claim against the estate, because before we move to that specific distributions or bequests that he's got, we first have to settle that claim. And sometimes what you as a testator or testatrix intended for people to get from your estate will not always happen, because you don't take that accrual claim into calculation. So that's the first thing I bring to the client's attention. The second thing is what we also pick up, and although this doesn't form part of the estate, is your retirement funds, and also we also look at the living at the life policy the client has. And in some cases we still do find whereby the client has not updated the beneficiary. So we found that in this scenario the client still had his ex-wife on these life policies, for example. So when he passes away, that life policy pays out to the ex-wife. And so it's important as part of the planning of your estate duty to ensure that these beneficiaries are consistently updated, and you need to keep a record of the beneficiaries being updated. The other thing that is also important when it comes to the life policy is that when you pass away, and especially in this case, this client, he was the person who worked in the family, so he provided for the family. And what you want to take into account is the fact that when you pass away, your whole estate gets frozen. Now, when your estate gets frozen, the question is, in the short to medium term, the family will need cash flow. And that is why it's important to have these life policies in place as well as a benefit. Because when we submit the last will and testament to the master, it can take a couple of weeks first to get a letter of executorship. And the question is, normally the surviving spouse and children will ask, okay, but now how are we going to start paying the bills? How are we going to continue living? So it's important that you've got these type of your pension fund, your provident fund, and because we don't have to administer or completely administer the estate to completion, that these type of policies and pension provident funds can actually pay out while the executor is busy administering the estate. So that is why it's important to look at your life cover. It's important to look at your retirement funds, to nominate the correct beneficiaries in that short to medium term, to make sure that there is actually liquidity available for the family to continue to do what they need to do while the administration of the estate is taking place. Yeah.
And how long? So, I mean, that liquidity is obviously quite an important factor, especially for the surviving spouse and beneficiaries. So, I mean, and typically, what is the timing to liquidity for some of those structures and investments?
Yeah, it's in my experience less than a month. It can take a week or two after they've submitted all the documentation, and then they basically pay it out directly to the surviving spouse or to the nominated beneficiary on that specific policy. And you don't want to be in a position where I was sitting in front of a client and the client is telling me, yes, but someone else is nominated, which is the ex-wife, for example, at that stage, and not me. And now where am I going to get the funds from to actually live and to pay for what I need to pay for me and for my kids? So it sounds, it doesn't sound important sometimes when you explain it to people. But these type of things can really affect, because at the end, when you pass away, the family will have to deal with what they have to deal with. And it's important to know that when you pass away, you want to ensure that when you're not there, that there are these type of vehicles that will take care of them while the administration of the estate is being taken place.
Yeah. Now, just while we on this, there's a question that came through here. So if a policy is paid directly to a beneficiary, how does that affect the claim against the estate?
So if the policy is directly paid to the beneficiary, in terms of, we just need to make sure in terms of claim against the estate, because what normally happens is when you are the surviving spouse and you have a claim against the estate, the executor must ensure that that claim gets paid out to that specific person. What we do for our clients specifically is when we draft the will and we've done a proper estate duty calculation and we know there's a claim against the estate, one can word the last will and testament in such a way to bequeath assets in lieu of that claim against the estate. So that life policy pays out outside, so that goes directly. So you can't come back and say, yes, but we're going to pull that money in as a claim against the estate.
Okay, thanks for that. So let's just get into the next step then, and I think we've dealt with this in quite a bit of detail, but I think it's always important getting into these offshore structures. So maybe just touch on these non-retirement assets around the direct stocks in UK, US, and the Irish fund.
Yes. In this scenario, this is where the last will and testament of the client plays a key role. So what we've got in this case, the clients at the joint will, it was still in Afrikaans. So basically what happens is when you've got direct offshore assets, especially domiciled in the UK CITES assets and US CITES assets, then normally, as a lot of clients will start to know, is that in South Africa, we have to deal with your estate in South Africa. So in order for us to administer the estate, we obtain a letter of executorship. Now, if you've got assets situated in the US and you've got assets situated in the UK, those are different jurisdictions. And we also have to go through a similar process in that jurisdiction. Now, in that jurisdiction, we need to apply, for example, in the UK for a grant of probate. When we obtain the grant of probate, then we can basically start acting in accordance to the last will and testament of the client. Now, if you've got a joint will and you've got an Afrikaans will, it makes it very complicated for that executor. Number one, that executor must first translate that will to English. That will must then be submitted to the Master of the High Court and it must get sealed. Only on that sealed will, after we've received it, can we submit it for probate, for a grant of probate in the UK. And that is additional cost, and that's a whole delay in the estate. And also it's important to understand translating from Afrikaans to English is not a Google Translate that you can use. You have to make sure that the core of what the testator is testatorily set out in the will comes through, and that is why it goes through the whole process to make sure it's 100% correct. So all of those type of elements can actually delay the administration of the estate and can result in additional cost. So what we normally advise clients, if you've got assets located in an offshore jurisdiction, depending on that specific jurisdiction, it's key and it's important to basically ensure that you've got a local will to deal with your local assets and an offshore will to deal with your offshore assets. Now, it's not a legal requirement to have an offshore will, but based on our experience, it just really helps in terms of the administration of the offshore assets in that offshore jurisdiction. And likewise, you've got the same principles in the US, because if there is US direct equities and you've invested in US corporations, then basically if it's above the $60,000 exemption, then basically from there we also have to do IRS submission. So it becomes what has looked as like a simple estate. It goes to the following people. The mechanism to get to the end of the administration of that estate, it can become complicated because these specific tools is not put in place.
And so maybe just two things around that as well. So maybe just for the benefit of all the viewers, what is your current practical experience with going through that court system and getting that will sealed again?
Okay, so
in terms of timing.
Yeah, in terms of timing, I think before COVID-19, it didn't take that long. Take like 2-3 months to get it. Under COVID-19 circumstances, we can sometimes wait up to 8 months or 9 months to get it done. So it can become it can become a long process because the circumstances under which we're living currently makes it difficult for us to actually get that sealed will faster from the master of the High Court. Yeah.
Okay, so that's why it's important, I think, as we've reiterated in all these webinars, that clients really need to look at that will and get that part right, especially with everyone moving, the amount of assets that they're moving offshore at the moment.
Yes.
Because that is something that we've seen in our client base. So definitely something that needs to be focused on.
Yes, definitely.
And the second part to that then is there's already a structuring opportunity there with those shares potentially, and even the CIS to look at, depending on the client's needs and their objectives.
Yes.
To look at potentially better structure in how to house those assets. Looking at the benefit or the potential tax liability now versus future tax liability on those things.
Yeah, that is correct because it gives you an opportunity. So that is why the estate duty planning, as I said at the beginning, is not something where you can just push figures into a Excel spreadsheet and it kicks you out what the estate duty and taxes will be. But what it allows you to do is to look at your client's affairs and to say what you have offshore and what planning opportunities are there in offshore in order for you to come out of the inheritance tax issues in the UK and also the same the US estate taxes. So that is when we get an opportunity to tell the client that if you use, for example, an offshore trust to house your offshore assets, then we can basically or we can avoid that issue. We can also talk to the client of the Glacier Global Life Plan that's also available for the client. So, but one will actually know that when you actually sit and you work through it with the client. Yes, there is a capital gains tax effect at the point when you have to transfer the assets into the most suitable vehicle for your client, but the growth on that and knowing it's outside of your estate is also a very big help at your date of death. Yeah.
I see we've definitely touched on an interesting point because there's got a lot of questions coming through. So maybe just there's a question. So the first thing is, should all wills be in English now? Is the first question, and maybe tied to that you can maybe. So there's quite a couple around why there's need for two wills. So, what should an offshore will say differently to a local will? So how do you distinguish the difference between that? Maybe just a bit of clarity on that. So the language thing and maybe why an offshore and a local will, maybe just explain that in a bit more detail.
Okay. So yes, I think it will definitely be of great benefit to have your will in English because it's just not a offshore element, but it's also South African element. It just makes it easier to administer the estate. So when you submit it to people that's looking at it, it's the business language, it's the global language. People understand English, so it just makes it much easier. So the way we draft our local wills in comparison to the way the offshore wills is drafted is sometimes different. We live in South Africa, so we've got our jurisdiction, and we have to make sure that our wills is written with the terminology we use. Like, for example, we will make use of the bare dominion and the use of fruct. So you will say, no, my bare dominion of the property will go to my children, but my wife will get the use of fruct, so she gets the use of the property. And when you've got that one will, and you send it offshore, if they don't have bare dominion and they don't have use of fruct, they're going to start asking, but what does this mean? Send it back to South Africa, let someone tell us what this legally means before we can issue you a grant of probate. So the terminology we use in South Africa differs sometimes from what they use offshore. So it's always good to say, when we draft the offshore will, we work with offshore solicitors to make sure that the will is drafted in that specific jurisdiction, understanding of when they look at it, they'll easily be able to interpret, this is the wishes of the testator or the testatrix, this is how the assets must be distributed. So that will be part of the key factors that they will be looking at. But to prevent that confusion, it's always good to say that let's ensure that we do it properly in line with the legislation, the law, and the requirements of that specific jurisdiction. Yeah.
Okay. So last couple of questions on the offshore trust thing. There's one more here around, do you need an offshore will, at least an offshore will, I'm saying offshore trust, offshore will, if your offshore, your only offshore asset is basically a loan to an offshore trust? How does that impact?
Yes. So basically, if you only have an offshore loan to an offshore trust, then one can see if it can be dealt with within the South African will, if that's the only element, but that will depend. What we normally would prefer is that we set it up in an offshore in the offshore will, and just basically cancel that loan. And we're going to touch that perhaps later in one of the clients' case, is that it's important, if there is a loan that is between yourself and an offshore trust or even a local trust, that specific loan basically gets cancelled at your date of death. Because if it doesn't get cancelled at your date of death, your executor must ensure that the loan gets repaid into your estate. And if you look at this client situation, there's not a lot of liquidity in that offshore trust. So if there's not a lot of liquidity in the offshore trust and that loan must be repaid and hasn't been cancelled at date of death, the question will be, where will the liquidity come from? And if you don't know where that liquidity is going to come from, then you're going to start having a problem. So these are small things, but it's important things that will really help you in terms of the administration of the estate. So yes, depending on the set of circumstances, we can see if we can handle it from the South African will, but my preference will be that we actually just do it properly and do it from an offshore will and just cancel that loan in the offshore trust, to the offshore trust. Yeah.
Sure. And then the last thing, we didn't touch much on the Irish fund, but maybe just why is it specifically important mentioning the Irish jurisdiction or domicile at least?
Yeah, so some of these funds that they are in Ireland is actually some of the funds that clients will invest in, and because of the jurisdiction and the way it's being structured, actually if I can use, for the lack of a better term, protects the client or actually fends the client against the UK inheritance tax issues. So that is why sometimes we say that, yes, I would like to invest offshore. I don't want to make use of other product. I want to invest in the funds. It's growing nicely, and that is where I want to be. Then the funds can actually help in terms of preventing you from being subject to UK inheritance tax.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so let's move on to the private company, Stanley. What would you recommend around that? What's the advice around that part of the structure?
So in terms of the private company, depending, in this case, it was a family company. So the father was he is the main shareholder, 100% shareholder, and the only director to the company. It's a family company, so the two children does work with him within the company. And so there's two elements. So there's the shares and there is the loan account. And in his will, he only dealt with the shares but never dealt with the loan account. So the same principle will therefore apply. Must that loan then be repaid at his date of death? Where will the liquidity come from in the company if there's not enough liquidity within the company to repay that loan? So basically, the other thing that is also important, especially for clients that's got companies that employs people, and they're the sole director and they're the sole shareholder, what's your plan of continuity? If you pass away, there's employees, they must get paid, there is stuff that needs to take place. So it's important that when you, especially in a family business, have a plan of continuity, bring your children in as working with you in the business, make them co-directors with you. So when you fall away one day and you pass away, it's easier for them to take over and to move forward within that company, so things doesn't come to a complete standstill at your date of death. And sometimes clients, that's one of the things that clients sometimes neglect, is actually to sacrifice. It's our family companies, our family business, for example. So what we want to do is it must continue, but in the family as part of the legacy that we have built in this family. But what you don't want at the end of the day is to sacrifice. If this is the case, what is the plan of continuity? To whom do we bequeath the shares? To whom do we bequeath the loan? And in this case, we recommended the client to bequeath the loan and the shares to the SA Trust, where the SA Trust will become the 100% shareholder of this family company and also have the loan. There's no other loans into the specific trust. And basically what will happen is that, yes, there will be estate duty. People are always a bit scared about how much estate duty and how much tax am I going to pay. Yes, there will be. But when you look at the bigger picture and this company is growing and you're starting to accumulate the wealth within this company, once you do that at your date of death, you're actually basically saying that this company, trust company structure, the growth in this company will now take place outside of the estate of the surviving spouse and outside of the estate of the children. So it is that's why sometimes having an asset discretionary trust in place, for example, is actually a good idea if it's there, because it can be useful in some of these structuring for clients. Yeah.
And some of the things you mentioned, I mean, it seems pretty obvious. If you've got a company, you need to have a continuity plan in that. But it's quite frightening how many clients actually don't prepare for that. I mean, do you see, is that something you see quite often?
Quite often. I've seen it last week. I've seen it again this week with clients passing away. In certain cases, they're the majority shareholder. There's minority shareholders in the company. How do we continue? You know, is there a buy and sell agreement in place that will place the other shareholders in a position to actually buy you out at your date of death? So all of this practical stuff must be put in place. And you find often that clients don't put it in place. And it does cause a bit of a problem. Now the question is, if we have to wait now for 3-4 weeks for the letter of executorship, what is the minority shareholders going to do? There is no other director, for example, to the company. So these elements are important elements, and these are the type of issues, the practical issues we address in your estate duty planning, because your estate duty planning is just not a calculation exercise, but it's also what are the practical things that will happen at date of death, and how do we make sure that at date of death it is more fluent.
Yeah. And that's why it's important, as you said, to review these things on a continuous basis, because these things will change year after year depending on the circumstances of the company, all of these things that we've mentioned here.
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get into the loan. So firstly, the loan to the family trust. Maybe let's just deal with the local trust firstly.
Yes. So in terms of the local trust, there is still a loan account, and that loan account basically funded for this client the holiday home. Primarily, and basically now, because there's not a lot of funds, or they don't want to dispose of any of the shares to repay the loan, the client is paying his loan is an interest-free loan, so he's subject to Section 7C. Annually on the interest on that loan forgone, so he's basically paying his donations tax over to SARS. And what they didn't do is he bequeathed it to the spouse.
Okay.
So you're not getting rid of the problem. The problem is just continuing when the spouse gets the loan. So what you want to do is to actually cancel that loan at your date of death, and that you do in your last will and testament. So in your last will and testament, you cancel that loan at date of death, so that basically the trust doesn't have to repay that loan, and you don't have to bequeath that loan to the surviving spouse. So it's important, those type of elements. So basically at the end, there's no loan account between any other family member. So that loan account is basically being cancelled at the date.
But a loan account surely can't just disappear. There must be some tax implications.
Yes. So that loan account, which is an asset in your hands, will just basically form part of your estate for estate duty.
Okay. And then let's get into the offshore trust. That's where things get a bit more.
Yeah, this is where it becomes a bit more complicated, and this is normally where we tell clients they have to seek specific tax and legal advice around the offshore structure. So in this case, the client said he does have an offshore trust. Himself and his 4 children were the beneficiaries of the offshore trust. There's a loan account to the offshore trust which funded the property they've got that he bought in the UK, and then basically he's got some shares as well within that offshore trust. But there's also a loan account, and I told him, pardon. What you can do is, or what I would recommend you to do, as I said earlier, is to basically cancel that loan account as part of your last will and testament. And also because he had the offshore trust already structured, it became easier to assist him to say, you've got all of these other offshore assets, you've got the offshore trust. So you've got the opportunity to, during your lifetime, donate some of those offshore assets into the offshore trust, or sell those offshore assets to the trustees of the offshore trust on loan account, or to bequeath those assets at your date of death into that specific loan account. And that means, in effect, once again, yes, you'll be subject to estate duty. So unfortunately, someone will have to pay the taxes, but then going forward, the surviving spouse and the children doesn't have to be subject to estate duty, and that specific trust can continue, and basically all of the assets can continue to grow within that offshore trust for them, and basically it's outside of the estate for estate duty and capital gains tax. So he had elements that one could use, and basically because he now became more transparent in what he's got, and we did the estate duty for him, we could tell him, this will be the CGT that you will be paying now. Are you willing to do it? And he says, yes, I'm willing to do it. Let's see how much of that we can transfer into the offshore trust, and it's got the liquidity available currently to pay that donation tax and capital gains taxes on it. But he's eliminating a problem for his wife and for his children going forward. Yeah.
Solving issues as we go along here. Now, just as I look through this, so I mean, post the divorce, there were some changes that were made. And let's just deal with this, because this is where things get a bit complicated. He's got 2 children that are minors still, and 2 children that are early 20s. So we can assume, because he's got that, if children are not older than 25 at the time of death, that the assets will vest in the trust. So we're talking about all other assets here, right?
So that's correct. So it's a worldwide will, so that means all of the assets. So in effect, what will then happen, should he pass away and the children is under the age of 25, all of the assets, meaning the local assets he bequeaths to them, including the offshore assets he has bequeathed to them, will have to come into the offshore trust. Now, the offshore assets, the local assets is perfectly fine. That we can live and deal with. But your offshore assets will be a bit of a problem, because a local trust cannot hold direct offshore assets. And I normally tell clients that when you normally take money out, your intention is never to bring that money back. But because you haven't properly looked at your estate, you haven't properly looked at your will, you have to bring those assets back. And the only time you can keep, the local trust can keep offshore assets is if you got Reserve Bank approval. So you need to have Reserve Bank approval for a local trust to actually hold direct offshore assets. And that approval, in my view or my experience, has never been given to people. So that assets must come back. Now, the coming back of the assets into this local trust means they have to sell those assets. So just not estate duty, now we talk about capital gains tax as well. So basically what you have done is all of your effort and your hard work to externalize those funds for them to keep it offshore, just at your date of death, just fall away, because it hasn't been dealt properly within your last will and testament.
So maybe just a practical part on that. So I mean, in your guidance to that client, so now you've got these offshore shares, funds, etc. Funds probably less of an issue, as we discussed, but on the direct share side, although the fund will also be an issue, going into the local trust in this case. So I mean, would the best be to either use something like a global life plan, or call it a wrapper, or a offshore trust, even the offshore trust that are already set up for that to be sold into that offshore trust at that point? Is that the sort of guidance you would give?
Yes. So the guidance we give to the client is, these different vehicles, not a lot, but there are a few vehicles out there, like the Glacier Global Life Plan, like an offshore trust or a dry trust, if one can set up for a client if they don't have a trust, is vehicles that we can use. But I normally ask clients, what is your objective? What do you want to achieve? Because just because one product saves clients from estate duty and taxes, doesn't mean that another client, it will fit the other client, because the other client prefers to have the direct equity. Sometimes they prefer to, for example, be invested in funds, and they say, no, we don't want to have a global life plan. We prefer the trust structure that will work in terms of what we want to achieve. So what you do is to give your client best advice, and we give our clients best advice. We give them the option. They're the taxpayers, they're the client. They can decide what they want to do. But your estate duty planning, whether it's for your local assets or for your offshore assets for your clients, must be in line with the objectives. What do you want to achieve? You cannot allow tax to be the driving force in terms of the decision making, because when tax changes, we have to change the structure again. So what is your objective? What do you want to achieve? And yes, in certain events, it will result in a bit of taxes, but at least we are aligned to what you want to achieve. So when you pass away, everything will devolve basically based on how you want it to devolve for your family.
Now, just staying with this local trust for a bit and these beneficiaries. Now, as we know, we've got a lot of our clients, a lot of the questions coming through here is specifically when a lot of the beneficiaries of that trust actually start moving. We specifically talk about the local interleavers trust here. So when those beneficiaries move offshore, is it better, especially when they move to places like the US, where we know the tax is very, very onerous to the beneficiaries and any distributions from the trust? But what is the recommendation when all the beneficiaries, an example, has emigrated from South Africa?
So depending on the, once again, the objective of the family, who is still in South Africa, who must still be taken care of from a South African point of view, who are the children that will be leaving South Africa, what is the intention of the trustees in terms of those trust assets for those specific children, is to say, if it is the case that these children are now formalizing their tax residency and they're going to settle, whether it's in Australia, the UK, or the US, etc., it gives us the opportunity to sit with the client and to tell the client, seeing that your children are moving and you're going to distribute some of these assets to them as trustees, you've applied your discretion, you said, no, it's best that we distribute some of these assets to the beneficiaries, is to sit with your advisor and to sit with the tax specialist or your legal advisor and to say that this is what the intentions are, and to see what jurisdiction they are going to, when are they going to go to that specific jurisdiction, and that gives the people the planning opportunity to say, fine, this portion of these assets we can distribute to them, because you still have got the conduit principle you can use. So you can still, before they cease the tax residency, distribute that portion of assets to them, and basically whatever capital gain is, you can basically distribute to them. They pay it at a lower rate of 18% instead of saying, let them go, they are now non-tax residents, but then you can't make use of the conduit principle. So planning plays a key role. Knowing when the children will be leaving, where they will be going, will play a key role in order for you to re-look at your SA assets and also your offshore assets, because not all offshore structures will work depending on where that specific person will become a resident and settle. So we will have to look at the whole structure and make sure that the whole structure basically speaks to the best type of advice from a tax point of view and a structural point of view for each specific individual, because it can be the case that one child goes to Canada, the other one is in Australia, the other one is in the US, the other one is for example, in the UK, and will this one structure offshore work for them? No, it will not. How do we structure it? So before people just decide to take their luggages and leave, the children decide to leave, we must sit around the table and say, let's take this opportunity to plan it properly, and then you reduce the tax liability at the end as well.
And then there's maybe just on those kids that have moved offshore, because I think there's quite a bit of confusion with this immigration status at the moment. So whether people have actually formally emigrated or not. So maybe just touch on that quickly, so people just understand. I know we've touched on it before, I think in the previous series, but there's definitely some questions coming through on if kids have moved offshore, is it better if they immigrate or don't immigrate? So maybe just clear up some confusion on that side.
So if the child did not immigrate before the end of Feb of this year, you cannot immigrate because immigration has fallen away. So before the legislation changed, what we did is the client said, okay, fine, I'm going to live in the UK. I'm going to settle in the UK. So I'm leaving South Africa with a degree of permanence with the intention of not coming back to South Africa. So you've made up your mind. So you're going to go there, you're going to work there, you're going to live your life there. So at that point in time, the client said, I'm ceasing to be a tax resident. You pay your extra charge. So this is just a broad overview of it. And then in addition to that, that's your tax leg. Was also a reserve bank leg before the change. And the Reserve Bank leg was to say that I also want to seize my exchange control residency. And that is where the South African Reserve Bank issue you with a letter to confirm that you have seized your exchange control residency. That is the one part. But that leg, the second leg, has fallen away. So we're basically only dealing with the cessation of your tax residency. So if there are any clients or children of clients that needs to formalize the residency, it will be the tax residency. You just have to seize your tax residency with SARS. We don't have the Reserve Bank leg anymore. And when you seize your tax residency with SARS, and then basically you've completed the process, and basically have to pay your extra charge if there's an extra charge to be paid. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, just a couple of extra questions coming through here. So one client specifically asked if they only have cash in UK bank. Is there anything required from an offshore will perspective, or will the SA will deal with that specifically?
Yeah, so depending if it's only offshore cash in the offshore bank account, we can basically deal with that from an SA will. But once again, if we deal that from an SA will, we still have to go through the formal processes offshore to get the grant of probate. So my advice again to the client will be, in order to make sure the one element is that I think that clients must also understand is that when you only have one will to deal with your local and your offshore assets, and we have to submit this one will to the Master of the High Court, it delays the process, because if you've got an offshore will as well with your local will, both processes can run it simultaneously. So why do you want to hamper a process that can run simultaneously? And when you're done with the offshore, you're basically done with the offshore, and you just have to deal with the local estate. So from a practical point of view, yes, we can use the one will, but we still have to go through the processes for it. So in order to not go through all of that processes, we can basically say, let's rather have two wills to basically deal, one with the offshore assets and one with the local assets.
So on the global life plan, there's a couple of questions here on that as well, but one particularly is if, you spoke about it earlier, if, as an example, we had to move some of these assets into a global life plan, you've often just got one product owner or policy owner and a couple of beneficiaries. Now, if that product owner dies, and sometimes you have one or two of the beneficiaries that unfortunately die as well in that process, how do the assets stay offshore for the remaining beneficiaries?
So basically, if you've nominated your beneficiaries, that asset basically remains offshore for those specific beneficiaries that you have nominated. So basically, with Glacier through the administrative process, they will basically just put the plan in the names of the beneficiaries that is nominated on the beneficiary list. Yeah.
But they'll still be subject, so that individual still needs approval for their offshore allowance, don't they? I mean, how would that?
No, they don't need approval for. Because remember that product is in a life policy offshore. You have nominated your beneficiaries. So when you pass away, then basically that beneficiaries will just basically step in, and they will then get the policy as allocated to them.
Okay. I don't know, for some reason I was always under the impression that you needed still to get approval as an individual, even as a beneficiary.
Yeah, because normally what people will do is they will just place it on record with the South African Reserve Bank to say that I am a beneficiary of a offshore specific product. This is basically what it is, but basically you put it on record with the Reserve Bank. So it's not as if you formally go to the Reserve Bank always to get approval for it. You just place it on record with them so that they can have it on record, yeah.
Okay, but no SARS approval in terms of the FIA or anything like that?
No.
Okay. All right, so Stanley, just getting back to this, so, that thing we said in the beginning where the client obviously thought this is a simple estate and that should just be dealt with a worldwide will. I mean, I think everything we've covered now clearly illustrates all the traps in this. So maybe just to give a final view on this before we kind of go into the closing. So, I mean, just I think wrap this up for us in a nice nutshell, the high level things that people always need to focus on, and I think your final parting shots, I think, in this scenario.
Yeah, so from my side, I think what is important is for the client, for me always what is important for the client is to say, this is all of the assets. I think clients have worked extremely hard to accumulate their wealth. And what you want to do is to make sure that everything goes according to how you want it to go, how you want those assets to be distributed at your date of death. So all of these elements, and there's many more other elements that one can look at, but it's always client specific, because no client situation is ever the same across the board. So each client, each family is unique. And from a high level point of view, I will say when you start, make sure that if it's your family, it is your wealth, make sure that you actually structure it according to your objectives in your family, how you want things to, and how you've built your legacy and want that legacy to continue, and how you want to distribute your wealth at your date of death. So we look at all of the elements, but it's important that one sit and see what elements does each client have, number one. Number two is then to say, if these are all the elements that we're looking at, what's your objective? And then basically to plan it around the objectives for the client. And we can drill then into the detail like we're doing with this client to see what actually we must do in order to give effect to that objectives of the client, yeah.
And I think what you mentioned is extremely important because, I mean, you know, at Sanlam Private Wealth, we obviously have a large part of our business is focused on investing and managing the assets, so both locally and offshore.
Yeah.
And I think most people often put the emphasis on that management part of the assets and how you're performing versus a benchmark or an objective. But I think what you're mentioning now, if you do not get that structuring right, I mean, you can wipe out a significant portion of your returns and potentially miss your objective if you don't get that part right.
Exactly, yeah. And that normally happens in the cases where clients is more focused on the taxes to be paid, the estate duty to be paid. And I normally tell clients is, let's forget about the taxes. I know it's difficult, and let's forget about the estate duty. I know it's difficult, but let's focus on your objectives. What do you want to achieve? And then we start building around it. And what you will find is that there are opportunities that we can identify in some of these estate planning that we do for clients to actually lessen that estate duty burden or to lessen the tax burden for the client. And there are vehicles we can use in order to assist in the administration of the estate or reducing the estate duty, like your offshore trust, like your global life plan, etc. So there are, but don't let tax be the driving force behind your decision making.
So hearing and kind of summarizing this, what you're saying, as we do with investments, you know, people want to make sure you're in the right asset class to get the right growth over time. So we know these different asset classes give different growth, and how you mix those asset classes. What are you saying that the taxes, the state duties, these are all just components of the entire plan? All of those things actually work together.
Exactly.
They have different roles they play, different, almost, if you want to call it friction, they might bring into the process.
Yeah.
But ultimately, you need to look at all these things together to really give a client the right outcome.
That is correct, because at the end is about protecting that legacy you started to build for yourself and for your family. And the question is, how do we protect that legacy? How do we ensure that that legacy that you as parents have built for your children continues and stays protected? So there are a lot of elements we can look at in order to make sure that it gets done properly. From making use of the vehicles that is available locally in South Africa, vehicles that's available offshore, but how do we preserve that legacy? And a lot of clients, as I said before, if you hear these stories and you hear their values and they sit with their children around the table, you actually hear how hard they have worked to accumulate this wealth and how much sacrifice they've put in. And what you want to do is to continue to preserve that and to let them take the legacy from you when you pass away one day and build on that. And what plan do we put in place from an estate duty point of view, which is one element in addition to your investments, etc., that you're doing, to ensure that that actually continue. And what you do as parents, I normally tell clients, is now you're exposing your children, and basically your children are now surrounded with a team of professionals, of a team of fiduciary and tax specialists, a team of investment specialists that will assist you to continue to build a legacy for the next generation. So it's a lot of work that went into it, but these type of small mistakes that you don't pick up in your last will and testament and your estate duty planning, just throwing something in Excel spreadsheet and pop something out to say, okay, fine, this is going to be your estate duty, that doesn't work. You've worked hard. It must be a proper job. Let's look at all of the elements and let's give proper advice in order for you to preserve that which you have built and continue that legacy for your next generation. Yeah.
Yeah, Sandy, I think thanks for that. I think it's a great way of wrapping it up, and I can see the passion you have for this, and why clients really enjoy engaging with you on this. So I think, thanks for joining me tonight, and then thanks for all the wisdom you've imparted. And I think what became clear, I mean, I think when you build out this case study and you start looking at it, it looks like an extremely complicated, messy affair. But I think what you've illustrated tonight, there's very clear-cut solutions for this, depending on the client's needs and how we can address the client. So thanks for that, and keep up the good work.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Only a pleasure. So I think from that, that's a wrap for us for this evening then. I just want to thank everyone for dialing in. And I think, just to reiterate again on this, so at Sanlam Private Wealth, the focus from our side is making sure that our clients understand from front to back what they're dealing with. We've got all the competence internally for our advisors and our business partners, the intermediaries that have dialed in as well. Hopefully you can see tonight the value we can add with you and your clients' lives as well, and give some guidance on this. So we look forward to engaging with you further on this. But I really want to thank you for dialing in, and I hope you enjoyed this series of webinars with us. And we look forward to engaging further with you. And as I said in the beginning, there will be a couple of extra questions we probably didn't get to tonight, but we will answer those in written form as we've done with the previous webinars. So thanks everyone, and stay safe out there, and we look forward to chatting again soon.